Good morning. Thank you to you and Ali and all the other conference organizers and volunteers for this. It's been a great conference so far, so appreciate that. Hi, I'm Marty Haught, and open source powers Ruby. It's probably not news to you. It is at the heart of our ecosystem, and it's interesting because all the building blocks we use to build our software are free, they're available, and you can, with the easy command line, get all those things downloaded, and you're off to the races building your software. But it's fascinating to think about how that works and how that's come to be. So I discovered Ruby in 2005. I had come from the Java world, and it was amazing. I was so excited when I moved over. I was surprised by how productive I was, how quickly I could take an idea to deployment and get it out there, and it was just amazing. I was also a little earlier in my career, so I probably didn't know a lot at that point, but I did know it was different, and it's fascinating to think about where we've come from since then. So at this point, Ruby is over 30 years old, which is amazing, and RubyGems and both Ruby and Rails are both over 20 years old. And so that is really impressive, and it's interesting to think about what has changed since then. So one, the ecosystem has matured. The rough edges, a lot of them are gone. I remember back in the day, we were still trying to figure out how to deploy a Rails app. It was not trivial to do that. Also, scale is at another level now. Like, it wasn't back in the day, but now it's impressive to think about how large the Ruby ecosystem is, how many packages we have, the dependencies are through the roof now. And we also have the rise of modern supply chain attacks. So it's something that I think a lot about these days that maybe you don't think about, but maybe you should. So a question that I've been thinking about is, we've made it this far, but what does it look like to go another 20 years? Are we poised for that? And do we just see how it goes? Do we let that unfold organically, or do we be a little more intentional and think about the gaps we might have today and how we can proactively address them as we continue to go along this journey? So I'm going to present some questions that I've been thinking about as the director of open source that are on my mind, and I'd like to share them with you today, and maybe we can have a conversation about that. So the first one is on reliability. We're going to cover 3 different aspects. The first is reliability. And so the question I've been thinking about is, what's the right level of reliability for RubyGems.org? A lot of what I'm going to talk about in this talk is about RubyGems.org, but I think you can apply it to open source in general as an ecosystem. So yeah, what is that right level of reliability? Do we strive to be enterprise grade? Do people expect that? Or do we go with more cost-efficient, best effort, since we are essentially a free service that doesn't have a revenue model? The next one is security. And are we ready for the growing threats to the supply chain, or are we not? And how do we handle increased compliance demands on our applications and businesses? And then finally, sustainability. How do we keep projects and maintainers healthy? And are we prepared to bring on the next generation of OS contributors or not? And then, of course, what's a realistic funding model that we can pursue and maintain? So as I mentioned, I'm the director of open source at Ruby Central. One thing that's interesting about this role is it is a brand new role. It was started back in August of last year, so I've been in this role for 9 months. We didn't have this role before that point. And so part of what we're doing is we're exploring what does it mean to have an open source program at Ruby Central. Most of you that know Ruby Central know that we run RubyConf and RailsConf in the United States. And we also have been running RubyGems since its inception. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And let's see, what else do I have here? So, yes, so another important piece about this is I'm new to running a package repository. I have no experience with RubyGems before I took this role, beyond being a consumer and user of the platform. But I have no experience running that. I don't have a deep experience with security either. I've been primarily shipping product my career, and so I know what it's like on that side, but security is all new to me. So it's been a bit of a fire hose and a fun experience learning at depth sort of what it takes to run RubyGems.org, as well as the security that's involved with it. So I think it's good to kind of explore where we came from and how this all got started. And here is a timeline of both Ruby Central and RubyGems. Ruby Central was formed in 2001 in an effort to support the first Ruby conference that was hosted in Tampa, Florida in 2001. And RubyGems had actually been discussed back in 2001, but it wasn't until 2003 when at RubyConf, they're like, we have to build this. And so several members, Chad Fowler, Rich Kilmer, Jim Wyrick, some others, got together and whipped out RubyGems.org over a weekend at a conference and actually deployed the very first RubyGem at the end of the conference in a lightning talk that Rich Kilmer gave, which is really fascinating. And so from there, it's continued its development. But one thing I want to sort of mention about this timeline, I'm not going to talk about all these different points in the timeline, but there's been this mentality of just enough. Like, what does it take to get this up and running? The very first version of RubyGems would not have scaled. I think Chad told me they had in mind that maybe there might be 100 gems or something like that. And so it wasn't built to scale much past that point. And so over these years, they've realized, okay, this was good enough, but now we need to scale it to the next level. We need to build in this reliability or whatever it is. And so that's been the story all these years. And so at the end of this timeline, we have Ruby Together merging with Ruby Central, which brought both operations and the infrastructure together for RubyGems.org, and that's what kicked off the creation of the open source program. So let's talk about this. As I mentioned, I'm the director of this, and this is brand new, so we're trying to explore what that means. So essentially, it is to run RubyGems.org, but we had the idea that it's more than just that. And when we formed the OSS committee, part of the mission of the committee was to define what should our charter be, where does that go, what are the potentials here, and this QR code does take you to the open source program page on RubyGems.org. You can just navigate there too, but we put the QR code here just in case you would like to use that. So we have that it's maintaining and improving critical infrastructure and tools for the Ruby ecosystem. That starts with RubyGems and Bundler, but it can go beyond that. And here is the mission that we defined as a committee. And I'm not going to read this to you at all, but there are 3 points I want to highlight. One is the first one, which is the high-quality, secure infrastructure, which is RubyGems.org. We know this is a service you rely on. It's very important. And so that is the first piece to sustainably run this. The next one is supporting impactful open source projects. And while that starts with RubyGems and Bundler, we think about this goes beyond that. Like, what other impactful projects are there out there that our ecosystem relies on that could use that support? So we think that that is something that we want to focus on in the future more. And the final one is fostering the growth of open source contributors, because this is something I've thought about and I wonder, like, where is that next generation coming from? What happens when the current maintainers retire or move on? Who takes up that mantle? And are we taking care of important RubyGems in that process? So let's talk about the state of RubyGems. Here are some stats for you. We have a bit of scale. So in the month of May, so last month, we served over 4 billion gem downloads for a total of 1.15 petabytes of bandwidth with average network traffic of 431 megabits per second. So that's 1,500 gems per second that are delivered. On the other side, we have 46 gigabytes of gem data ingested. So that's you pushing new gems or publishing an update to a current gem. So we have a bit of scale. So what does it take to run RubyGems.org? Well, these are all the different aspects that we have for the operations. We've got that. We've got on-call, so we have both a primary and secondary on-call that watches over the service. We do regular upgrades and security patches for the infrastructure and RubyGems.org, which is a Rails app, as you can imagine. We have customer support. Customer support looks like people needing account access, so MFA lockouts or other concerns with account access, gem deletion, and gem transfers. So those are the 3 common support tickets that come in. And we have security vulnerability reports. So we get reports from HackerOne on the security of RubyGems.org. Most of those are garbage. A lot of AI-generated ones they look real, but they really aren't. It is fascinating to watch these tickets come in, and you shake your head at a lot of it, but there have been several important reports that have come in that have helped us improve the service. So that's a constant demand on the team's time to dealing with those. And then, of course, we do regular RubyGems and bundler releases, at least monthly, sometimes twice a month. And that keeps security patches coming to RubyGems so that you know that you've got the current version. Let's talk about funding. This is a free service, but it's not free to run. So in 2024, we had a $1.2 million budget. And we're going to talk a little bit about this. I'll talk more about the grants in the future of the talk, but we have 15% of our budget comes from donated services, so we do get credits for AWS and Datadog, so we don't have to pay out of pocket for that. So that's nice. That helps reduce the cost of operating RubyGems. Our membership program, which we inherited from Ruby Together, covers about 8% of our budget. Sponsorships, which is a new thing that Ruby Central has started, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on this talk, is 15%, and over 62 or almost 62% of our budget last year was grant funding. Grant funding is wonderful, but it's got some limitations with that, which we'll cover in a moment. So for 2025, we have a $1.4 million budget forecasted, and we're doing pretty well, but one aspect that's a little tricky is that we have a gap in funding, so we haven't quite raised enough money to cover the budget for the year, and so that gap is something that I have to reconcile and deal with, and it usually means that we cut back being leaner with our maintenance, and we delay certain projects because there isn't funding for that. The good news is we are down to 51% for grant funding, which is probably why there's a gap. So let's move on to reliability as our first question that we're going to explore. So what would happen if RubyGems.org went down? Like, what would you do? Let's say it was down for 4 hours. Take a day off, like, yeah, yep, right. Yeah, so like I wrote down my thoughts, like you might not notice. You just would probably check and just come back. You would wait for it to come back up, right? What if it was down for 4 days? What was that? Yeah, a funny tweet. I'm curious how many of you could build and deploy if RubyGems.org wasn't up? A few of you, maybe. You haven't tried it, so you don't really know? Yeah, I was like, well, you just vendor your gems, right? It's fine. Well, I asked the team a little bit more about this. What would happen? And first of all, if you use a paid service like Artifactory or Cloudsmith, which some of the bigger companies do use, they wouldn't notice. They just wouldn't be able to update gems. You could also run your own private mirror. So you could do that, and then you don't have to worry about that. I asked Maciej Mansfeld about Kafka users, and he estimated that 95% of his users do not vendor or have a mirroring service, and thus would not be able to deploy or update their app. The team also said it would be painful, that while you can cache your gems locally and you can vendor and all that, there are some cases where it won't work like you expect. So it's one of those things like, oh yeah, we can totally recover, until you try and realize one little thing didn't work and actually you can. So now hopefully we don't go down for 4 days, but what would happen if we were down for 4 weeks? I mean, I'd be asked a lot of questions at 4 days anyway, but 4 weeks would be like, what's going on? So I don't actually think this is a realistic scenario. I don't even think 4 days is a realistic scenario, but it's an interesting thought experiment to have of the impact of a service like RubyGems.org on the ecosystem and our ability to build and deploy our applications. So back to my question, what's the right level of reliability for RubyGems.org? Because one of the things that, I guess I don't want to move on to that one yet. So one of the things that I think about with this is that we've been really fortunate with the service. Like, I guess I would ask, how many of you can recall the last time we were down? Yeah, it's been a while. So I guess we'll move on to this slide at this point. So on-call, I want to give you some stats on on-call. For 2024, we, first of all, we had our 2 rotations, primary and secondary. We had a total of 83 notifications. The majority of those resolved themselves within an hour. So they aren't necessarily a wake you up kind of page, but we do check up on that. We had 100% uptime, so we didn't have any downtime last year. We do have isolated degradations of service. Typically, our job queue is where we get hit. Sometimes indexing is also a little slow, so people will reach out and say, look, I pushed a gem and I'm not seeing it yet. And it's like, yeah, the index hasn't rebuilt, so give it a little bit of time. That's typically the areas where you notice, but generally speaking, you can just continue to bundle install and pull down gems without any issue. For 2025, the one thing I'm going to mention here that's changing is that we have grant funding for the secondary rotation that has been exhausted, so we actually will end the secondary rotation after June. So we'll go down to a single rotation, which is most likely fine, but like what happens when the primary doesn't respond in the middle of the night or whenever. And so we are discussing what an alternative escalation policy is. Essentially what we call this is best effort response, which essentially it goes to a Slack channel, and the next time someone's awake and notices, they'll get to it if the primary doesn't respond. So that means the service could go down for hours, potentially, if the primary doesn't able to respond. So let's talk about disaster recovery. And as I mentioned, we haven't gone down in a while. It's actually 2013 was the last time there was a major outage for RubyGems.org. So that's over 10 years with no outages, which is actually mind-boggling. I'm shocked that this service that has such volume hasn't had an outage in 10 years, but it's true. Maybe that's just good fortune. It's also good systems design. I mean, the service is well built and designed well, so that's fantastic. But as a sort of factor of this, we actually don't have a formal disaster recovery plan. Now, we have backups. I mentioned here we've got nightly backups, and we have long-term storage. We have redundancy in gems storage, so if we did have a full outage, we could recover from that. 90% of our infrastructure is defined in Terraform, so we know we can bring that back up. But it's 90%, it's not 100%. We haven't rebuilt production since 2013. So which is usually not great. You want to know that you can rebuild your service completely from the ground up. So right now, we're best guess at how quickly we recover from a full outage. We suspect it's probably in the 4 to 8 hour range, but there might be that one piece that no one touched in 8 years that we now have to reverse engineer and figure out and find the right person who last touched it and get it up and running. So this is a little bit of a concern on my part for this piece, but hey, we haven't gone down, so maybe we're fine. Well, anyway, so maybe that's not the best answer we could put together. So we have currently a proposal to work on this. First of all, establish an SLA. I mean, it's a free service, so it's not like you have a contract with us. So what's an SLA there? But we do still feel we should have an SLA for the community so they know what to expect from a service you depend on. And we want to, as part of this, draft a formal disaster recovery plan and test its execution. We have talked about having a hot read-only standby so that if there is a loss, that immediately can switch over to that. So at least the serving of our current gems continues without losing a beat. This proposal is not funded yet, so this is still in the draft phase, but we don't know how we would fund it. So that would be something we'd have to figure out. I'm going to talk about a security audit we did last year. I've put this under reliability because the learnings and sort of the action items from this audit, the majority is around how we manage our infrastructure. So we had Trail of Bits perform a third-party audit last year, looking at the security of both RubyGems.org as an application, but also its infrastructure. And we did post a blog post about this in December, so maybe you read it, but if you're curious, you can go to the RubyGems.org blog and go back to December, and you'll see the post talking about the audit and sort of its findings. But I'm highlighting the main points around infrastructure that we learned and now we're thinking about. So with this, we have a proposal. It's actually our biggest proposal for this year in terms of work. And these are some of the goals that we're looking for with this proposal. So first of all, principle of least privilege. Right now we have, our team has full access to production in AWS. And so if, say, one of our engineers' laptops was compromised or his account was compromised, then they would have a full reign to go and be quite destructive with our infrastructure. And so that's not great. We want to eliminate long-lived credentials, and we want to make a sort of a comprehensive observability platform for us to watch all events happening with our platform. And then minimize the manual manipulations, because right now when the team deploys changes, it's Terraform from their laptop, so it's not going through a build pipeline or anything like that. So there's a bunch of things that we would like to change. So here is the proposal. Like I said, it's our big project for 2025. We do have the initial phase funded, which changes over to an SSO for access for teams, so no longer long-lived credentials, and also we'll do full SIEM integration, so that gives us that observability layer to watch what's happening. 80% of this proposal is not funded yet, so it's one of those things where until we have that funding, it's gonna be on hold until that happens. The other piece is this serves as the basis for a lot of other reliability projects because it includes 100% Terraform automation for all the infrastructure, for everything. So what's our reliability outlook? What am I thinking about with this? So first of all, great system performance with zero downtime. You can't complain with that. That's great, that's fantastic. Not great, we're going down to a single call rotation, but maybe it's fine. So that's sort of like falling back to a lean budget and a best effort reliability because of the budget we have, the gaps we have on funding, and then of course our big work around improving the security of our infrastructure and how we manage that is paused due for funding. Let's move on to security. So what would happen if malicious code was injected into one of your gem dependencies and you didn't notice and you pushed to production? Would that be bad? How many are familiar with the SolarWinds supply chain attack? How many of you were impacted by this? Probably none. I don't know how many Ruby shops had this in their stack, but yeah, this is a big deal. So the companies that had SolarWinds installed were scrambling, and it's pretty scary to think about sort of like what happened with this and how it caught so many companies. This thought they were secure and had this nailed, how it impacted them. So supply chain attacks are real. Last month, there was one with NPM packages infecting Cursor users and stealing credentials. That's scary. And even earlier this month, there were some malicious RubyGems uploaded that were caught, but not until they were deployed. And so it was using typo squatting. So hopefully you check the actual names of the gems before you install them. But there were some users who pulled them down and used them. And so this happened just earlier this month. So this is a constant threat. It's out there, it's happening. And I guess the question I would ask you is, how confident are you that your apps won't be compromised if a gem does get compromised and pushed up to rubygems.org? So just for some stats, the last 12 months, we have yanked 43 malicious gems. We don't actually have an official malicious gem scanning program. This is Maciej Mansfeld, who you may know Maciej. He works for Mint.io now. He wrote the code that does this, but essentially, he does this on his own. Every week or so, he does scanning of RubyGems through our public API, finds malicious gems, and lets us know to pull them down. It's great, but this is post-publishing, so that means that it's not part of the publishing flow, so a gem could be uploaded, and it might be a week or so before it's caught and then pulled down. So it's great that we have this, and we also do retroactive rescans. It does mean that there's a window of time where something malicious could be pushed up. So definitely be cautious with your gems. So the question that I asked here is, are we ready for the growing threats to supply chain security? And the answer is, I think we're in decent shape. So here's a breakdown of the common attack vectors that we see with supply chain security. Account takeover is probably the scariest one, because that means that someone whose account has access to maybe an important gem, if that account got taken over and someone got access and was able to push a gem that is commonly used, heavily used, that would actually be a problem. And so that's probably the most concerning attack vector that we take very seriously. We mentioned malicious gem publishing as one. We also have typo squatting and dependency confusion as two others that are something to keep in mind. So how do we deal with this? Well, this is the principles for package repository security is something, if you're curious more about this, this is something that we use as a guide. This was published by the Securing Software Repos Working Group, which I'm a member of. This is under Linux Foundation's OpenSSF, and they published this, so you can go and search for this and read more about it. And essentially it defines levels for maturity of these different aspects of supply chain security that we have, and we use this to guide us and think about what are we not doing, what should we prioritize next in our in the work we do around supply chain security. So recent improvements. The last few years, last two and a half years, we've been working on improving supply chain security for RubyGems.org. The first one, authentication authorization. This is our account takeover defense. That's MFA and tighter permissions around gems, and that's sort of the basis there. We now have trusted publishing and SigStore implemented on RubyGems.org. That's thanks to Samuel Giddens, our security engineer, whose work is funded through AWS or Alpha Omega, depending on the year, and that's fantastic. And so that's sort of like, that's how we are confident that a gem is published by who we think it's published by, and that is what it says it is. Its contents are what we believe it's to be. The one downside is only 5% adoption of SigStore so far for our top downloaded gems. Now, this was released late last year, so it is fairly new, but the point I'm making here is that there's a concern of mine that adoption of these improved security postures is actually the biggest concern. And that is something we want to sort of spread awareness around and help encourage gem maintainers to upgrade and adopt these more secure approaches to how they publish their gems. So for 2025, we have a fair amount of work in mind. Samuel is currently working on precompiled binaries, which was mentioned yesterday. So precompiled binaries by default is something that we're thinking about for RubyGems.org, and also binary transparency, which helps with knowing the contents of package uploads. So these are two things that we're working on. I expect that there will be an RFC later this summer on precompiled binaries, so you can see sort of what we're thinking, how would it change the publishing flow, how would it impact a maintainer, and also how would it impact you when you're installing RubyGems. We also have a desire to bring a bundle audit command into Bundler and have that be part of the flow. So that's something that we're looking at. And then we've talked about bringing the malicious gem scanning in-house and have it being part of our publishing flow. The funding aspects of this, 75% is grant-based, which essentially is Samuel's salary. So that is 75% of our security funding. The bundle audit and the malicious gem project are unfunded at this point, so they'll pause and wait until we have additional funding for those. Next question, how will increased compliance requirements impact us? The answer is, I think they will. How many of you are familiar with the Cyber Resilience Act? So a few of you. Well, you're gonna become really familiar with this very soon. All right, so this is a new legislation passed by the EU Commission, and it's basically GDPR for cybersecurity. And it's something that I've been learning a lot about in the last 6 months. It will affect all commercial products in the EU market, sort of like GDPR did, and it includes open source dependencies. So now you're gonna have to be aware of your entire stack of your application and be able to understand any vulnerabilities in that stack and patch them. So it's going to be a big deal. Important note, while the legislation has been finalized, there's a lot to be determined on the technical details about how this will roll out, what exactly, how will the obligations be interpreted? Because it's a law, but then there's like, how will the courts view it, and what's the practical guidance for companies on how to meet these demands? So those are still being worked out. The expectation is by the end of the summer, we should have pretty good guidance on all those aspects. The industry is involved, that's great. So it's not just lawmakers passing a law and saying, well, good luck with that, industry. So luckily, we do have 2 working groups. I'm a member of both of these working groups that are involved and giving feedback to the commission around how can we make this feasible for companies to meet the obligations, how can we make it clear, and make sure that the language lawmakers are using actually matches how we think and talk about the industry. So that's great. By the way, these meetings are, things take a long time in these meetings. I'm surprised by the level of discuss something, meet again, and maybe make a decision. So things move slowly in this world. I'm not a lawyer, and this is not legal advice. You will want to involve legal or compliance, and I'm sure they'll get very involved at some point in this future as we move on this timeline. I'm going to give you a very short highlight of the CRA. This could be its own talk. It should be its own talk. And at some point, I'm sure I'll give that talk, but today is not that time. So I'm just going to give you a little taste of what this looks like for you. So the first piece to know is that they talk about products with digital elements as the thing that is being regulated. And so here's some examples of what that is. Essentially, if you're interacting with the internet and you have data and all that, you're pretty much going, and you make money with it, it's commercial, then you're going to be impacted. Do note that non-commercial or regular websites are not in scope for this, so don't worry about your blogs, that won't be a problem, but this is essentially what is in scope. The law talks about multiple roles. It doesn't officially talk about an OSS developer, it's implied, but I think it's an important one that we're going to talk about briefly here. Also, an open source steward is a concept in the law, as well as the manufacturer. The manufacturer is the company building the software. So, OSS developers, you have no obligations in this law as long as there's not commercial activity. So if there's commercial activity, then you might have obligations. It depends on what that commercial activity looks like. So if you're charging for a price, if you're charging for services, then most likely you'll have to comply. You can receive some financial support or donations. That doesn't automatically mean that's commercial activity, so it depends, I think, on the percentage of the donations versus your costs. Again, this is where you want to involve a lawyer to understand, will you have to comply or not? I do expect we're going to see a lot of patches coming from manufacturers as this takes full effect. So I do think that's going to impact the life of the OSS maintainer. You don't have any obligations to do anything with that necessarily, but I imagine there's like, hey, I have a fix for a vulnerability. I want to patch it upstream. Here's a PR. Can you approve that? Can you now get that published into a new release? So I expect that's going to be a reality. And then there's also going to be a best practice to provide evidence of security in your repository. So like some of the things we talked about with like supply chain security earlier, that is what I would expect, that they'll want you to do that in your project, because there's a whole proving the security of the stack that the obligation for the manufacturer has, that I think that they'll want to see evidence of that in actual individual packages. Open source stewards, that's us. That's any sort of foundation that helps deliver software in the open source world, like RubyGems.org is an open source steward, so this is what I get to look forward to. I won't spend any time on this one because I don't think there's probably too many open source stewards out there. And then manufacturers. Okay, so here, this is a very short list. I'm not going to go too much into this, but the first one I want to highlight is that you have to ensure that cybersecurity is by design and by default a part of your application. So if it isn't already, you'll probably want to start looking into that. The next one is vulnerability handling and reporting. So you're going to have to be aware of any vulnerabilities in your stack, and you have to be able to report that. So that's something you're going to have to do. And the final one here is there is patching of exploitable vulnerabilities that you'll have to do as well. And there's a tight deadline for that. Let's talk about dates. When does this actually happen? It is next year. So September 2026 is when the reporting of vulnerabilities will be required. And by December 2027 is when everything, the patching and all that will then be part of your obligation. Penalties are significant, so you will not want to ignore this. The global turnover is an interesting term that basically means gross revenue for your company. So it's not by product, it's by company. So I think if you're a big company, you're gonna pay attention to this. So yeah. And resources. OpenSSF has been putting together a lot of very useful resources on the CRA. So if you wanna learn more, I would just search for OpenSSF CRA. They have a page, there's the URL for it. And it'll give you a really good introduction. They also have a free online course. It's about an hour long that you can take, and after that hour, you'll have a pretty good understanding of what the law is and what sort of like how it'll apply to you. So that is the CRA. So what is Ruby Central's role in this? So this is something that I'm thinking quite a lot about. I feel that we want to educate and spread awareness of this because we want to make this less onerous for our community to have to deal with this, those that have to comply and are in the EU market. We want to provide guidance for both maintainers and manufacturers. There's a concern that some maintainers are just gonna opt out. They're like, nope, I don't care enough. I don't want to maintain this gem anymore because I'm scared of what it's going to do to my project. I don't think it's going to be, I think there's a lot of fear around that. I don't think it's going to be quite like that, but I think there is guidance that is needed to reassure maintainers that they're not going to be negatively impacted by this. And then the other one is we want to improve tooling around compliance, so just make it easier for you to build the SBOM's software bill of materials, which is one of the primary things for understanding what's in your software. Okay, security outlook. This is our best funded aspect. I think there's a lot of attention on this, and I feel pretty good that we're moving in the right direction on security. I do have a concern with the grant funding, and I'll talk a little bit more about grants in the next section. I am concerned about the lack of awareness and adoption of best practices. I think that's going to be the piece that if we build all these great security features, if no one uses them, is it any good? So I think there's some concern there. And then I think the CRA is going to cause quite the scramble, and I'm sorry, but that's how it is. Okay, sustainability, my last aspect to explore. So how do we keep projects and maintainers healthy? I think this is a perfect screenshot for this. This is, the random person in Nebraska, right? Nebraska's a state in the United States. It's not too far from me, so it's pretty, there's not a lot of people in Nebraska. Okay, I pulled up some stats on abandoned gems. So we have like over 180,000 gems on RubyGems.org. Over 85% haven't been touched in 5 years. I think we can probably say that they're abandoned. Maybe not, maybe some that are 6 or 7 years old, maybe not. And while this isn't surprising or maybe inherently bad, gems have a natural life cycle, maybe they're not forever. I do have some concern that there are people and applications still using gems that have been abandoned. And what does that do what does that mean for our ecosystem? So I do have some concern around that, but I think this is a very interesting number if you've never seen this. More concerning, though, is some of these are actively and heavily used still. So we're going to look at Representable. It had 10 million downloads in May. Here's its page on Ruby Toolbox. It hasn't been touched in 3 years and doesn't appear to be maintained anymore. So what's the possibility that there's a security vulnerability or an issue in this one, or could become one in the future? We don't know. How many are familiar with the XE utils attack? Yeah, so this is interesting. If you haven't learned about this, it would be probably a good read for you to look at this. This is a cautionary tale about how social engineering on a burned out maintainer opened the door for a sophisticated attack. And so, could this happen to one of our heavily used RubyGems? Sure. And that's where I think this is very real. I mean, I'm not aware of this happening yet with one of our gems, but what if Nokogiri or some other gem that's used heavily were to, someone's like, I'm done, here, you can have this and take care of it. oh yeah, we'll take care of it, and then they sneak something in, right? We wouldn't be able to catch that very quickly. So that's definitely a concern. Another thing that we've been thinking about is gyms that haven't adopted better security practices. And here are some examples of what that looks like. So we don't know if they build on modern versions of Ruby. They don't have a good way of reporting sort of issues, vulnerabilities found in a gym. And so this is something that I think will become more of a factor. And so what do we do about that, especially if the maintainer is not that active anymore? So here are some thoughts I have on this one. The first is really a question is, as a package repository, should we take a more active role in deprecation? If we see that a gem maintainer is no longer responding, is no longer pushing updates, should we take more of an active role? I'm not sure about that one, maybe. The next one here is, should we publish a gem maintainer's guide that makes it easier for gem maintainers to do the right thing and to make it easier for them to know what that is and give them some guidance there? And then bringing awareness to unmaintained high-volume gems like representable, those types of gems that are still used by other gems that maybe we should go ahead and see if we can find someone to take over this actively. And this last one is a thought, adopted gem, which is, here kind of our current thinking on this is, could we connect active OSS contributors to gems in need and help transfer the ownership of that and make sure that they're able to take care of that? Should we provide a playbook for adopting a security feature so we make that easier? Maybe we provide minimal updates so at least it runs on the current versions of Ruby. And we could internally, with our team, step in on critical gems if there's no one else doing that. So this is a thought that we've had. Another piece of sustainability is called fiscal sponsorship. This is something that nonprofits in the United States are able to do, and essentially you can see a summary here where we allow the transfer of funding. So you can make charitable contributions or donations to a project, and we can facilitate that to a project through our legal status as a nonprofit. Some good examples, the Software Freedom Conservancy and the Open Collective are two examples of this out there. And Ruby Central is now doing this too. And so actually Hanami is our first recipient of this program. It's a pilot to help Tim raise money for Hanami. A good important note, we don't actually do the fundraising. We are just essentially like a clearinghouse that handles the incoming funds and allows sort of the project to use those funds for development or other purposes for their project. So it does simplify fundraising. The good news is that a higher percentage of those donations go to the actual project, so that's great. And I think in our mind, like what other projects might be interested in this program that we'd like to talk to you in the future. So you can keep that in mind if you have any that would be interested or might want to talk to us, please make an introduction. So next question, how do we prepare our future OSS contributors? Where do they come from? So a little bit, here's some thoughts on the current status quo. It feels very organic and very happenstance that maintainers come or the turnover of maintainers happens. There's very much maintainer attrition. We see this. I mean, you saw from the stats from RubyGems.org of all the abandoned gems. So this does lead to abandoned projects. And I think there are some projects that the community would like them to be carried on, but there's no one to take care of them. So I think that this is definitely a problem that we have, and I would love for us to think about how we can address it. So some thoughts that I've had here. This aspect of the program, by the way, is we haven't really done anything with like creating an on-ramp for OSS contributors, but something we've been thinking about. So can we make it easier for new members to contribute? That's always a good thing to think about, developing onboarding or training to make that easier. I think, though, that we're going to have to intentionally recruit. And also funding is an important piece. I think the expectation that someone will maintain an important gem for free is unrealistic. And I think we need to ponder that and internalize that and think about how as an ecosystem we address that. Which leads us to our next question. What are realistic funding models to pursue? So in 2024, there was a funding report that was put together from GitHub, the Linux Foundation, and researchers at Harvard University. They found that over $7.7 billion was contributed annually to open source software primarily in Linux, I bet. But that they found that 86% of those contributions was employee labor. So employers hiring people to work on open source, at least some percentage of their time. So let's talk about the funding models that I see. So the first one is employee staffing. This is a common model you see that is used where a company will hire a maintainer and just say, here, work on this project. So we see companies like Shopify doing this. There's plenty others that do this. I think this is a great model, and it's good to think about how we can use it, but it's not ideal for a service. For RubyGems.org, it's not great for us. The other thing that it does is it creates this overhead, so there's more communication and collaboration is a little bit harder when they're not part of your team, and who knows how much of your time they get. Will they be around when you need them for a certain piece of work? And the bigger question is what happens when business interests change? And this actually happened earlier in the life cycle of Bundler. Bundler was developed by EngineYard, if you recall, when MERB was a thing and merged with Rails. And for many years, Bundler and RubyGems development was funded by EngineYard, and that changed in 2015 when EngineYard decided it was no longer in their interest or they couldn't afford it, and they stopped development entirely. That actually led to the creation of Ruby Together, when Andre Arco realized he needed to find a way of funding RubyGems and Bundler development and maintenance, and he went his own way and created a 501c6 to do that. So this happens, and it can happen. So that's sort of a concern there. With grants are great, but they're not always there. They're not sustainable, they're not renewable. They're typically one-time funding, and we had a lot of grant funding in the last 2 years, but those grants are no longer available. So now I'm in the position of figuring out how to replace grant money when it's no longer available to us. It's also not a fit for critical services or maintenance. I don't really want to try and think about how I do operations on grants. It's not something I want to do. Fundraising is a classic model. This is what nonprofits typically do. So this looks like donations, annual memberships, or sponsorships are great. That's typically the approach that we use. But this requires constant work. You have to build up the program, you have to convince that there's a need, find those people that want to contribute, and then convince them that we're worth that investment, that they should give us that money. But this is typically what we do. There's another option which is interesting to explore. This is not available for a lot of open source projects, but it is available potentially for services, which is you build something that has business value that companies will pay for. And what's interesting here is PyPI, which is our sister index in Python. They built this organizations feature last year, which has a paid tier for organizations. And so that is something we have a beta out for organizations, so we could explore possibly having organizations being a paid feature. But this is tricky because when you're a free platform, like you don't just start charging. You can't do that. That's not fair. It's not what RubyGems is about anyway, so we don't have those options. So something to just be aware of. Okay, so 2025, this is the forecast I shared earlier. Just notice that we have this gap, and this is causing us to be leaner in our operations budget. It has projects being on hold. So this is definitely a concern of mine in terms of how I keep RubyGems going and strong as it is now, well into the future. So this brings us to a new program we started last year, which is the corporate sponsorship program. For some context, Ruby Central, before the pandemic, made a lot of money with conferences. And so that funded all this work previously. But that is no longer the case. So now the open source program has to figure out how to fund itself. And so this is our primary mechanism that we're using. So you can go and check this out if you know a company that might want to help support us. This is the current mechanism we have that I encourage you to check out. There's another approach that I've been thinking about, which is what if we had a very low effort entry point for companies to support us? So like annual amounts of $2,000 to $5,000 that would help support operations. And the idea is that we'd go for volume. So what if there was 500 companies that did this around the world? Like that would be a huge relief to operations and how to keep the core functions of RubyGems.org going. So this is something I've been thinking about that could be useful. I think the other piece here that's nice is that it demonstrates broad support from the community for a service like RubyGems. And I think that's really important so that others see that, yes, we do need help, it's important, we want to keep this going and strong, and this is, you are being part of that support for the platform. So it's something I've been thinking about. I haven't really, this is the first time I've mentioned this, so still early on. So sustainability outlook. I think there's a lot of, this is my biggest concern really of all these aspects. I think there's a lot of risk with abandoned gems that we need to pay attention to. Like where's the next level, sort of next generation of OSS contributors coming from? Can we be more intentional about that? And then what is funding gaps and sort of a lack of a sustainable funding model do to our future? Like, will there be a point where this is a problem? So going forward, I'm an optimistic person, and I know we can be scrappy. The service is not going to go down. We're fine that way, but it makes it a lot harder. And so it's hard for me to imagine 20 years from now, if we don't solve some of these problems, how we're going to be in as strong of a state that we are today. I think Ruby is special. We all know that we're here. The community is a gift. And I think that it's up to us as a community to figure out how we make this sustainable for our ecosystem. And so there's a question in my mind, which way should we go? Should we stay lean and just enough, or is there an opportunity to do more, to support our community more and do more with open source in the Ruby ecosystem? And I think that the answer to this is really, what does support look like from the community? If that support shows up, that allows us to do more. Otherwise, we're gonna have to be very scrappy. So how can you help? I think, first of all, I'd love to hear about the problems you're seeing. I've talked to lots of folks, but I would love to hear from more of you. There are things I'm not aware of, so I want to hear from you, the problems you see, the ideas you might have, how to address that. I would love to tap your creativity. I'd also like to know what part of my message resonated with you. It's always tricky to know how should I communicate this to others. So anyway, spread awareness, make introductions. That's how I could use your help, and thank you.